thank you, Rayanne. Thank you, everybody, for joining. We're here today to take a look at the Seth Pomoy Fowler in the collection, and we'll get into looking at it in just a second, but this is going to be a little bit different selections from the collection today. Since we're focused on one object rather than a topic, we're going to take a really close look at this Fowler and talk about Seth Pomeroy's history and his life. And then we're going to look at a number of other firearms from the collection and some other Revolutionary War artifacts to put Seth Pomeroy and this Fowler in particular into a broader context from the era. So without further ado, this is the Fowler in the collection. I'm trying to get it all the way in the camera here, on screen rather. So you can see I'm about 6'2", so you can see this is a large firearm. There we go. Now this is called a Fowler because it was made for hunting, particularly for hunting waterfowl, hence the word Fowler. This was originally donated to the SAR in 1983 by Charles Card of the Kentucky Society. He lived here in Louisville. And he was a direct descendant of Pelignois of Connecticut, who carried this in the Revolution. He was a captain in the 8th Connecticut Militia. Now, the reason we really wanted to write about this for selections for the collection is that a couple of years ago, with the museum coming up on the horizon, we really started taking a closer look at all of the artifacts in the collection. To consider them if they're going to be ready for display, are they right for the museum, asking those types of questions. And this Fowler was recorded as being made by Ebenezer Pomeroy and made in the 1720s or 1730s. So we're taking a closer look at it, and as we start examining it, we start realizing that that's probably not accurate. Just based on the overall shape of this gun, especially the butt over here, and then some of the components that we will take a closer look at here in a few minutes. This gun is really probably dates from the 1750s to 1760s. And it looks like it's actually made by Seth Pomoy, is what we determined. And we figured that out by looking at records of gunsmiths in the Pomeroy family. Seth Pomoy is a 4th generation gunsmith, working in Northampton, Massachusetts, which is at the western end of the state. It's in the Connecticut River Valley, so way out there in the western end. But so as we're researching this, we're like, okay, so it's made by Seth Pomoy, and then we start learning who Seth Pomoy is. He lived from 1706 to 1777, and he was a prolific gunsmith, blacksmith. He served in the military from the 1730s until the day he died in 1777. When he was 7 years old, he was still serving in the military. He's a very remarkable person. He just keeps popping up in the historic record throughout his life at a lot of the significant events. He is a snowshoe man, so he volunteered as part of his community in Northampton that during the wintertime, he would be essentially a Minuteman. And in the wintertime, within a minute, they would be out in their snowshoes ready to respond to an enemy threat. He's at the Siege of Louisbourg in 1745, where he actually leads an effort to unspike 20 cannons that the French had spiked. And he led a team to do that over a couple of days, and they then turned those cannons on the fort and captured it. He is serving at Fort George during the French and Indian War. He is not only serving, but they knew he was a gunsmith, so he is fixing firearms while he is also serving in the military. And while he is serving, he actually is promoted several times. After the end of the French and Indian War, he returns to Northampton, where he is working with his family. It's really not just Seth Pomoy working. He had his sons working with him. We actually know from correspondence during the French and Indian War that his wife is running the shop while he is away. She is also fixing guns and working with individuals to get their firearms fixed or producing new firearms. So for a couple of decades, he is back in Northampton. He serves in his local community in elected positions. And with the onset of the American Revolution, or rather in the years leading up to it, he is elected to represent his district in the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. So he is a legislator. He is a sheriff of his county. And then following Lexington and Concord and leading up to the siege of Boston, Seth Pomoy actually rides through the night in June 1775 to be present for the Battle of Bunker Hill, where he is actually put in charge of a detachment on the left flank. And he fights the Battle of Bunker Hill at the age of 69. While at the Battle of Bunker Hill, according to records, he was actually fighting with Fowler, similar to this one, that was 30 years old, that he had made. And his gun was actually broken during the fight. So the story goes. But he continued to fight with the butt of his broken gun and sticks around Boston afterwards during the siege. And he becomes the first person Continental Congress offers a brigadier general's commission to serve under Washington. But Seth Pomoy turns Congress down because he wants to stay in Massachusetts and remain a general in the Massachusetts militia. He's serving in that capacity, and he is called south after Washington evacuates New York. He is heading south of a detachment of Massachusetts militia to join the Continental Army, and he actually dies en route, and he was buried in New York, and he has since been reinterred in Massachusetts. So this is one of a handful of firearms Seth Pomoy made that is still known to exist. The only other one in public collections is currently on display at the Museum of the American Revolution. And now the SAR has one, and we've been sharing this with scholars and other museum professionals. And the consensus really is that this is indeed a Seth Pomoy Fowler. There's really no one else who could have made this. And as we'll see here in a few minutes, it is signed by him. And everything else about it is indicative of a Seth Pomoy gun. So if we want to switch to the other camera view, we can take a closer look at this. So we're going to start off here by looking at the signature, trying to get that in focus for you. So there you can see it in front of the hammer is written Pomeroy. So he only wrote his last name on there. On the other example, the gun that's on display at the Museum of the American Revolution, that one is signed S. Pomeroy. So this is actually where a lot of the discussion is based around is why didn't he not put an S on this? We've actually looked at a lot of the other products. Well, actually the handful of other products that he made that still exists. On a lot of those, he signed them either S. Pomeroy or SP. So the discussion was really based around why did he not put an S on here? Why did he not include his first name? And the answer is really that he was a very busy craftsman. This is not atypical for craftsmen of the 18th century. They were very busy. The English language was not standardized yet. So for some people, the way they spelled their own names were not uniform. It would really depend on what their mood was that day or how they felt like signing it. So he only signed it Pomeroy, but if we looked at other signatures, especially like on documents and letters, the P on there that's very distinctive, that is how Seth always signed P in his name. So we're going to take a look now too on the barrel. It's difficult to see there, but as I move the light back and forth, you can see the top of the barrel is inscribed Northampton, where he worked. So again, this was another clue that this was indeed made by Seth Pomoy. So while Seth Pomoy is credited as the gunsmith for this gun, he did not make it lock, stock, and barrel, so to speak. He was probably more accurately credited as assembling this gun or possibly overseeing its construction. As we said, he was running a workshop. His sons were working in there. We know that he had apprentices from nearby villages working under him, learning the trade. So he may have only put the finishing touches on this. So this is another point of discussion that we're looking at is this accurately said to be made by Seth Pomoy, the workshop of Seth Pomoy, constructed by Seth Pomoy? These might seem like minor details, but it is important when you think about how we're going to credit this as having been made. So Seth Pomoy likely did not make any of the metal components on this gun. It is likely reassembled French parts. So as we come down the gun here, as we look at, so here is the butt plate. There's the tang on there. That is a distinctively French design with French engravings on there. Those are done to a very high degree. We're going to come back here and look again at the lock plate. This is a very typical French style plate, and especially back here on the tang, this engraving on here, and then also in the rest of the plate, very typical of French guns from the era. The trigger guard, again, very typically French, and especially the bow here has what's called a double post. So that's this part and this part. That is very typically French. And then the engraving there on the bow. And then as we come down, this design at the end, also very typically French. Let me flip this around for you quick, be right back. So this is the side plate. Again, this is a design and a shape that is found on other New England Fowlers from the era, from the 1750s, 1760s. And again, these are essentially recycled French parts. The same is probably also true of the barrel. Seth inscribed Northampton on there, or someone from his workshop. Trying to get this to focus. So you can see here at the breech, there is what's sometimes called a Christmas tree design. And then as you run the length of the barrel, there is a design along the top. And then as we get out here towards the muzzle, there is a rudimentary fleur-de-lis there, right here next to my thumb. So flip it over, you can see there is a repair here. This is probably a period repair to hold the ramrod in place, and then also to keep it assembled. This is very common of New England guns from the era. There's also right here, you can see this might be from the late 18th century or possibly the 19th century, but you can see that the neck of the stock broke, so it was reassembled. And there is, if I can get this to focus, some writing right there. So we're still doing some research into this, but that appears to say it's the letters U-B-O-I-K-E. And I've been talking to some other scholars, and they think that that might be a phonetic spelling for the Latin word ubique, which is Latin for everywhere. So that may have been a motto for someone who fixed this, possibly Seth Pomoy. So the question becomes, why are there so many French parts on here? So this is very typical for New England Fowlers of the mid to late 18th century. During the 18th century, when Canada was still under French control, they were importing firearms to trade for those beaver pelts. a lot of those firearms were used during the French and Indian War, and then they also found their way into New England. And hunters and marksmen in New England fell in love with those French hunting guns. So after the war, a lot of those guns made their way into New England, and New England gunsmiths started reproducing those French hunting guns, and when possible, reusing those parts from those French guns. I'm going to take this out. So Drew, if you want to switch back up. This is a very recently donated, trying to get it on the screen for you. This one is even longer than the one we were just looking at. This is actually a mid-18th century French hunting gun, or fusil de chasse. This was donated by Tim Ward of the Ohio Society in memory of Ralph Sackett Jr., also of the Ohio Society. This is one of those French hunting guns. All these components were made in France, and this would have been imported probably to Montreal or somewhere up the St. Lawrence. And this one was carried by Simon Vrooman during the American Revolution. So you can see, again, I'm 6'2", and I am having difficulty getting this completely on the screen. This gun is about 76 inches long. And this has a lot of those original French parts. So Seth Pomoy and other New England gunsmiths, they are looking at French guns like this when they are thinking about designing these Fowlers. So if we want to switch to this other camera, Drew, we'll take a quick look at this one. So this one has been converted to percussion. It probably saw continued use into the 19th century. Turn the light on for you. And it is difficult to see. We are actually working on hopefully getting this gun conserved so we'll be able to see a little bit better. But there's actually right here, you can see it says La Pernelle Frères, which is French for the Pernelle brothers. They were a well-known exporter of French hunting guns in the mid-18th century. And this barrel on the underside, so we can't see it without taking the gun apart. But if you could imagine going through the stock in here, this barrel is made at Saint Etienne, and it is actually marked by a very well-known barrel maker. You have, again, very distinctive French side plate. Very distinctive. Doing my best here to try to get a good view of these very reflective parts for you. Very distinctive French butt plate. So as New England gunsmiths are starting to develop the New England Fowler, they're really looking at firearms like this from the mid-18th century, and they're making their own versions of them. So when they can get their hands on French components like with this gun, they will. But a lot of times these New England Fowlers that you'll find, they were making reproduction French parts as well. They're trying to stick with the branding, so to speak, because they were so highly sought after. So as we said, this gun was carried by Jacob Vrooman during the Revolution. Set this back down for you quick. So these are decidedly civilian hunting guns. These are your workaday guns carried around farms. They're used for fowl hunting and for hunting small game. So they are not made for military use. However, from the very beginning of the American Revolution, during Lexington and Concord, after the action was over, a British officer was quoted as saying, quote, "These fellows were generally good marksmen, and many of them used long guns made for duck shooting." He's talking about guns specifically like this. So when we hear about the Minutemen shooting from behind the walls along Battle Road on April 19th, 1775, they're using guns like this. And there's actually ongoing research right now looking at why or how those guns were so accurate. And some researchers are actually finding that the smaller caliber of these hunting guns combined with the longer barrels actually created greater energy in the projectile. So your typical British military muskets shooting a 75 caliber ball. French muskets are shooting 69 caliber. Hunting guns like this are typically shooting in the mid to high 40 caliber. But what they're actually finding, these researchers today, is that those 40 caliber balls are imparting greater energy into their target than those military grade balls. And they're not sure if marksmen in the 18th century knew this or not. They're still trying to find evidence of that, but they think that it's just kind of the situation that happened, and it wasn't a tactical decision, but the fact that they were using these civilian hunting guns actually gave them an advantage. So we have one more example here. Yeah, thank you, Drew. This is another New England style Fowler. Step back here. Sorry, I'm doing my best to get these whole things on the camera for you. So again, this is another very long firearm, and this is called a club butt Fowler, and this was donated by Jim and Terry Lindley of the Washington Society. So this is called a club butt Fowler because of this butt down here. You can see this is actually a holdover from the Pilgrim era. If you think about those 16th century firearms that you might see sometimes, this is that very distinct shape coming over from Europe. But again, this is an American style hunting gun. And this gun was purportedly used during the siege of Boston and in the early years of the war. So again, this is what at the beginning of the Revolution, before you start seeing those large numbers of French muskets being imported, this is what a lot of your militia, especially, and even some men in the Continental Army are fighting with these civilian grade hunting guns. We'll take a quick look at some components on this. So you can see the unsigned lock on here is very rudimentary. It's kind of a mix between a French and a British style lock. And this one in particular is very interesting. It's very indicatively American. If you can see on the hammer here, there's actually a plate that's been riveted on there. It's likely the hammer on this gun broke at some point, but especially, during the Revolution, they did not have replacement parts. They had to use what they had. So this gun was patched and put back into use. If this was a European gun, especially a British military gun, they would have just completely replaced that part. Again, this gun has another period repair here. You can see the stock has been put back together. It's likely that this firearm was dropped or experienced some kind of traumatic event at some point, and the stock broke here, and it also broke back here. But again, these American firearms are being fixed, patched back together, being put back into use. And this one also exhibits other American traits in that it's a combination of parts. This is a rudimentary Dutch style side plate mixed with a early British style butt plate. But you've got this very typically American carving here around the end of the barrel tang. Very rudimentary trigger guard, likely American made. You can see once again down here, this broke probably when the stock broke right here, and it is just pinned back together. So you can see these civilian grade firearms that a lot of militia and Minutemen are fighting with. They're very big. I can tell you my arms are getting tired from rolling these around for you. They are not light. I would not want to be marching 10 or 20 miles carrying one of these. But they used what was available to them. So one facet of these civilian hunting guns is that the barrels are not made to mount a bayonet, which means if you are fighting, especially in formation, you are going to have to carry an extra blade with you. So we have here, this is a mid to late 18th century knife donated by Edmund McKinley, Chancellor General Edmund McKinley of the Alabama Society. You can see this is a pretty rudimentary, probably American-made blade. Just blacksmith forged, very simple cross guard, octagonal wooden grip on here, hammer in the end, hammer nail into the end, excuse me. You can see this is very rudimentary, but it would do what you need it to do. So serving in an 18th century military, especially the British military, which the Continental Army was largely based on, they followed a lot of the decorum. A soldier was supposed to have a firearm and at least 2 edged weapons. So typically that was a bayonet, and we'll take a look at one of those in a little bit. But a lot of American soldiers, especially your militiamen who are carrying hunting guns, are going to carry a knife like this. They might carry a small short sword. Alternatively, a lot of them were carrying a hatchet or a belt axe or a tomahawk. Now, in the 18th century, all of those terms are pretty interchangeable. This is a pretty typical blacksmith forged belt axe or half axe. You can see, get the camera up here a little bit. You can actually see right here where the seam is coming together. This would have been produced probably by a colonial blacksmith by just making a long strap of iron, and it would have been wrapped around a pole, and then this would have been hammered to fuse it. But this is your very typical belt axe of the 18th century. This is a reproduction handle in here, but it gives you a sense of very typically 18th century. And this is a good fighting weapon, but it is also really good for use in camp or while you're on the march for splitting wood. They usually have a bit of a flat back here, so you could use it as a rudimentary hammer. But these were very preferred, especially by militiamen and especially the rifle units. When you start talking about, Morgan's riflemen, somebody trained to use one of these could be very effective. They're very quiet and they do not need to be reloaded. So a lot of your American soldiers are going to be carrying a knife or a small sword and a belt axe. So, yeah. As opposed to your American soldier, especially Pelignois, who's going to be carrying his Seth Pomoy made Fowler, they're going to be going up against British troops carrying your standard British military musket. This is a pattern 1777 British infantry musket, also known as a Brown Bess. This is very typical for what would have been handed to a soldier. So you can see it is much shorter. It weighs a little bit less. It is not as pretty or nice to look at as one of those American Fowlers, but it is a little bit beefier. You'll see these stocks are not going to be breaking. They have much more uniform design. And then importantly, on the end here, thank you, Jacob, you can mount a bayonet. So if you imagine fighting in the American Revolution and you are carrying an American Fowler and you have a belt dagger or a belt axe, if you are going to be engaging in formation type battles and you're going up trained British units who are all going to have a Brown Bess with a 20-plus-inch blade on the end of their muskets, it gives you a pretty good idea why we see that a lot of militia units were not participating in full battles. They were often At the beginning of the battles, they would be at the front. This is especially true if you imagine like cowpens. They specifically would use those militia units because they were not set up to fight in formation because their firearms could not take a bayonet. So that changes the way that you're going to fight. You can take a quick closer look at some of the components on this brown vest. So again, if you imagine or think back to when we were looking at that Fowler, everything on this brown vest, for lack of a better word, is just going to be chunkier. It's going to be bigger. It's going to be more robust. So you have a larger lock plate on here. You can see in here, it's a little worn away, but you have the King cipher. And then here above my finger is the crown over the broad arrow. That means this gun was official property of the King and official property of the British military. Back here on the back of the lock plate, you have Tower. Turn this light off, might show up better. There we go. After the 1750s, they stopped putting individual lock makers' names on the back of the lock plates. So some earlier guns, you might see names like Jordan. There were some pretty well-known lock makers who had their names on there. After the 1750s, all of those names were moved to the inside and Tower was on everything. So again, you can see a little bit, well, not a little, sorry. Move this up for you. Trigger guard is going to be more rudimentary. It's not going to be as much decoration. Side plate, again, when you compare it to those civilian hunting guns, and especially those American Fowlers using French components, very plain, very utilitarian. Your butt plate, very utilitarian compared to those civilian hunting guns. And one last quick look at that. And most importantly, out here at the end, so again, compared to those civilian hunting guns, all three examples that we looked at today were stocked to the end of the barrel, all the way to the breech. A military grade gun is going to have this last few inches of the breech. It's going to end here so you can mount that bayonet. And on the brown bess, you have this top mounted bayonet lug, which also doubles as your sight. So if your firearm is not, does not have the breech cut back, they did have what were called plug bayonets were an option. This is essentially a knife with a cone-shaped handle that you could just jam into the end of your barrel. But you could imagine issues with that if you are actually in combat and you are engaged in hand-to-hand combat, that blade could pretty easily be pulled out. So this is one of those main differences between your military and civilian grade firearms. And you will find during the Revolution that some militiamen or even some Continental soldiers who were carrying civilian firearms would have their firearms modified to have the stock cut back, and they would have a lug placed on there so they could mount a bayonet. Okay, so here we have, get that centered up for you. This is another American-made firearm, but you'll notice that it does look distinctively military in grade or in style. This is an American-made copy of a brown bess. This was donated by Dr. Samuel C. Powell of North Carolina. We're very thankful to have this one. This is probably a late French and Indian War or just after the French and Indian War era firearm. This is going to be made in North America, probably specifically for militia duty. It does, at first look, it looks like a brown bess, but it is a little bit shorter. Again, you can see this is probably the smallest of all of the firearms that we're going to look at today. But again, this is a distinctly military gun. Whoever owned this probably bought it to as their requirement for their militia duty. So they would have been using this for their militia duty for drilling. And then if they did serve in the American Revolution, they definitely could have used this. You can see the end here is cut back. You do have that rudimentary lug on top. And it uses a lot of a combination probably of recycled Brown Bess parts. And then there are some American-made components on here that were made to look like Brown Bess parts. So if we want to take a closer look at this. Thank you, Drew. So again, as we examine this, think about it in comparison to that Seth Pomoy gun. Again, everything on here is going to be more robust, but in terms of comparing it to that pattern 1777 Brown Bess, this is going to be not quite as finished. It is going to be a little bit rougher, so to speak. So you can see this is probably an American-made copy of a standard issue Brown Bess lock. There's no signature on there. This is not a recycled Brown Bess lock, but this is this distinctive British, what they call the banana shape. Looks like a banana laying on its side. It's made to resemble the British Brown Bess standard infantry lock. Down here, if you can remember that trigger guard from that Brown Bess, this is probably an American-made copy of that Brown Bess trigger guard. So they're trying to make this look like a military-grade gun, but again, they're working with what they have. Now, a distinctly American feature from that time period, as you'll see over here, there's no side plate. You just have these two screws that are holding the lock in place on the other side. They just have some rudimentary washers to hold it in there. Now, this is not as ideal because it's not going to be as strong. You have more stress going on that wood. But this was really made to be pretty utilitarian. Again, it's following Brown Bess design. You have the escutcheon here. That actually may be a recycled Brown Bess part. And then back here, you have what is likely an American butt plate. So again, in comparison, if you think about the person who would have purchased this, they are making decisions based on their militia duty. So this would fulfill that. But this might also be serving as their hunting gun. So in comparison to, that New England Fowler being made by Seth Pomoy versus this, you had decisions to make about what type of firearm you're going to have. Again, you can see here, the stock is cut back so you can get that bayonet on there, making it, very decidedly military rather than civilian. One last look at that overall. Okay, so when thinking about that Fowler made by Seth Pomoy.
Yep, go back.
Yep, you can just stay down there. Thank you. As we said, they could shoot roughly a mid to high 40s, sometimes low 50 calibers ball. But during the Revolution, it was popular for especially militiamen using those hunting guns to shoot what was called buck and ball. So that would be that high 40 caliber ball with buckshot in front of it. So oftentimes during the Revolution, you would find soldiers with casting molds like this one. This was donated by Ken Goodson and Paul Callahan in the Michigan Society. I'm appreciative to them for this, but you can see this to focus a little better. There, so you can see you've got your full-size ball, and then above it, you've got smaller slots for making your shot. So while you are casting, you can make everything you need. And then you can also see there's 3 different size ball molds in there. So this is also typical for the Revolution, for American soldiers. If you think about a militia unit, a lot of these guys are going to be bringing their hunting guns from home. They have imported barrels. They have French barrels. They have Spanish barrels. They have English barrels. So you're going to have various size calibers firearms in a single unit. So if you have a mold like this, at one time you can make these different size balls. So you could be making ammunition for all these different civilian grade firearms that are being brought. And then you're also going to be making your buckshot to go along with it. This one still has one original wooden handle on here. Oftentimes you'll find these where they do not have this wooden handle. This is very typical of the second half of the 18th century. And this one, you can see here, is actually signed AK. We are still trying to track down who AK was. There are a number of other museums who have brass implements with that signature on there. We're not sure exactly who that is, but we know that he was working probably from the 1760s to the late 1780s, somewhere around in there. But again, this is what you're going to be carrying with you out in the field to make your own ammunition. Okay, so you've made your ammunition, you have your fowling piece, and you are heading out into the field and you need to load your firearm. So you're using your Seth Pomoy made Fowler. To begin with, you're going to start with a priming horn like this one. This one was donated by Tony L. Bovetz of the Louisiana Society. And you can see this is a very small horn, and this is made specifically to prime the pan in your hunting gun. This one dates from anywhere from 1750 to 1850. These are very difficult to date because they were used for so long. And unless they're signed or associated with the person, there's a very large time frame they can come from. But you can see this is just a smaller horn that would be easier to pour that powder into your pan to prime it for firing. Very just rudimentary cow's horn, wooden plug in there, and couple of brass tacks around it to keep it in place. But this would just be a small little horn you carry for priming. Okay, and then moving on, so you're going to load your main charge and prepare that for firing. This is a powder horn we're very excited to share with you. This actually just arrived at headquarters yesterday. This is a 1770s, possibly 1760s powder horn. You can see it's got this ring around here. And then it's also got, it's broken off here a little bit, but it's got this tab sticking out. It's got 2 holes. You can see this is a much larger horn. So this is for loading the main charge into your fowling piece or musket. This would be worn around the waist. And you can see this curve on here would actually let it sit comfortably on your hip. And then interestingly as well, this horn, this up a little. This horn says AW 1776 AUG 27. So it is dated for the Battle of Brooklyn. So this horn was likely carried by most likely a militiaman in the Battle of Brooklyn or the evacuation of New York. So a very special piece to have in the collection now. But many different types of powder horns for loading your fowlers. So you have your powder in your fowler. You're going to load your main bullet. So you might be carrying a pouch like this. This is a bullet pouch. This was donated by Jeff Thomas of the Virginia Society. So you can see this has actually been what's called jacked. So it's been treated with tar to make it waterproof. But this is just a rudimentary leather pouch, and it's big enough to hold that musket ball in there. So this would hold musket balls. This one is actually sized to hold standard French infantry musket size. So this opening is just over 69 caliber. So you keep your full-size musket balls in there, and then you would also carry a shot pouch. So this is where you would keep the smaller bullets or your shot, so to speak, your BBs. You can see that's just a little bit smaller, but you'd be using those to load your full charge. So that'd be, whether you're hunting or in a military setting. So, okay. Thank you for your attention. Those are all of the objects we had to go over. And I think we have time for a few questions if anybody has them.
I got a couple of questions.
Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
On the Pomeroy firearms, did he specialize in any particular type of wood, or did he just use whatever wood was available?
That's difficult to answer because there's not enough examples. There's not enough of a sample pool, so to speak. But he's using pretty typical for the era. The one that the SAR has is probably a fruit wood. I think it's a cherry stock. He had his hands in a lot of different things. So he was pulling teeth. He was shoeing horses. He was making bear traps. He was making really anything that you could imagine that a blacksmith would make. So gunsmithing was a small sliver of his business. And it appears that the guns he was making were higher end hunting guns. So he's probably using a fruit wood. But if you look at other New England Fowlers, you're going to find a lot of times you're going to find maple.
Yeah, but of the ones we know that he made, it's just whatever wood.
Yeah, and
fruit wood?
it would also be up to the buyer as well. They might have a preference for what they want based on aesthetics.
And then on the pan and the lock of the Pomeroy, was that a repair or?
Yeah, so it was converted to percussion, and then we think around the time that it was donated, it was converted back to flintlock, probably by an amateur.
It looked very amateurish.
I'm being diplomatic. Yeah. It could have been done better. If it was donated today, I probably would have just left it as percussion rather than monkey around with it.
Any other questions? Feel free to type them in the chat box as well, if you'd rather do that. While we're waiting for any questions, I'd like to remind you that this is part of a series of articles that's in the SAR magazine. So be sure and check out the article version of this in the latest SAR magazine. Also would like to give a special thanks to Drew Height and Jacob Kaler, who are working behind the scenes to make this possible. Thank you both. Any other questions?
I have a question for just anyone. This reminds me today, I've thought many times about the limited amount of firepower that these militia would have to take into the field. It seemed like they had a limited number of musket balls and limited number or amount of powder. And I just wondered how they sustained themselves as far as an ongoing battle situation or a siege or, for a period of days. How did they restock? Somebody must have that answer. I know nothing about period firearms. It just seems like they had very little, they had few resources to fight with.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say that's accurate, especially at the beginning of the war. You can read some of Washington's general orders, especially in 1775, early 76. The soldiers had enough powder for some days it was 3 shots per man. So they sought out melee weapons, so spears, pikes, swords as much as possible because They had a very limited amount of powder. As the war goes on, that is a constant resource the Continental Army is looking for, especially when you're on the march, to keep enough powder for the men. And then especially when you think about how much powder cannons will go through. So that's a constant struggle throughout the war. And to answer that is that they did the best with what they had. Probably very few commanders had as much powder as they would have liked to have had.
Zach, we have a question from the chat box from Jeff Wood of the Maryland Society. He wants to know, did they make cartridges for buck and ball? Individual loading would take longer time.
Oh, that's a good question. I have to admit that I am actually not sure. I've never seen one. Most of the cartridge boxes that have survived are military grade caliber. So most of them are, 69 to 75 caliber. I suspect soldiers were making cartridges for buck and ball, though. Yeah, I'm sorry, I cannot answer that one definitively. I need to do some research after the presentation today. That's a good question.
I got kind of a follow-up comment on what Howard said. Another thing we forget about too in our 20th and 21st century is flints were another thing that was hard to source. I wouldn't claim to be an expert on this, but what I have read is that a lot of times when the Americans captured a ship, one of the first things they would look at in the manifest is if they were carrying flints or not, because all the good flints came from Europe. And that was, and during when the British were putting the embargo on Boston, they banned the importation of flints into Boston.
Yeah, that's a good follow-up, Scott. That is true that a lot of American colonists definitely preferred French. Sorry, is somebody else talking?
Well, I was just going to come on. This is Jeff Wood. Yeah, they would go through that manifest. Powder first, flint second. Absolutely.
Yeah, I was just gonna follow you up, Scott, that the European-made flints were definitely preferred.
All right, any other questions? All right, well, I think that wraps up this session of Selections from the Collection Live. Thank you so much for joining us. We will be doing another next quarter in April. Date is yet TBD, but we will certainly let you all know and hope you can join us then.